I'm a little bit hesitant to speak because there's a lot of teachers of mine in this room, of the internet and of other subjects, economics, but the teacher of this for me is Jim Cooper, who has been in Congress. He was one of the youngest members elected in the history of Congress, and as old as he is right now, that means that he's been one of the members who's been around as long as about 20 other members of Congress. And I think the first thing to recognize, which he taught me, is how the place has changed. It's easy for us to think that the kind of problems we want to talk about are problems that have been there forever, and at some level they have, but we've seen the kind of hockey stick here too. And the hockey stick here too is the radical increase in the kind of influence, the economy of influence that produces the type of problems that we're talking about. Now, I use words like economy of influence. Jim summarizes the problem in Congress as that Capitol Hill has become a farm league for K Street. Much more compelling way to understand the problem. And a farm league for K Street, not necessarily just about members, but increasingly staffers who think of their life, their business model, as a business model focused on their life after public service, their life as lobbyists. Now, the part that I want to add to the story, though, here that I think this group could grok well is the instability of the system that we've produced. And one way to see it is this. So the Constitution hands out a resource in a democracy that we all have called the vote. And that resource, the Constitution says, must be absolutely equal. So if your district is architected so that your vote is 0.1% bigger than mine, the Constitution says we got to redraw your district so that our votes are exactly equal. And those votes happen in discrete moments. We have like a primary, we have a general election. And those discrete moments, we all are equal. And the product of that equality is a very conservative with a small c system. Radical changes don't happen overnight because you got to convince a bunch of people to support the change. And having to convince a bunch of people from all across society is a really valuable thing. All right, now contrast that with a second election that we conduct every 2 years. That's the money election. The money election is the election which we conduct where people give their money to candidates so that candidates can then run their elections. And the thing that has happened slowly and now much more quickly since Citizens United is the concentration of influence in the money election. So 0.26% of Americans, 0.26, 1/4% of Americans give more than $200 in a congressional election. 0.05 give the maximum amount to any congressional candidate. 0.01, the 1% of the 1% give more than $10,000 in an election cycle. And 0.000063%, 196 Americans, have given 80% of the super PAC money in the presidential election so far. 196 Americans. Okay, so what that means is, if you look at the graph for votes, everybody's basically equal. You look at the graph for money influence, it's basically nothing until you get to the very top, and the tiniest slice of the 1% is having this kind of influence. Now, why is that a problem? Well, it's a problem because the instability that it produces for the democracy. Because what that means is, whenever you have an issue that you'd like to block reform on, block change on, where there's an incumbent, and that incumbent would like to stop anything that gets in their way, it's a relatively small number of people that you've got to recruit to your cause. A relatively small number of funders are going to be sufficient to get the money you need to steer policy away from this kind of change. So, PIPA SOPA was an amazing victory at the end of a series of 20 years of defeats. Because in the system, they could concentrate influence so much through this money that they could protect against the emerging internet, because that's just the economy of influence that system has. AT&T, the outrageous things going on in the context of internet service right now. Jim spoke about people who don't have access to broadband. Some states like North Carolina began to have communities that provided broadband service by community organizations. They would set up these broadband community organizations. This broadband service was symmetrical fiber service. So North Carolina was the worst state in the nation. The symmetrical broadband service was cheap and fast that would be provided. Last year, exactly a year ago, North Carolina passed the 19th state to pass a law basically banning communities from doing this. Why did they pass this law banning communities doing this? Because AT&T and Verizon have spent unbelievable amounts of money to get these state legislatures to stop this new competitor. And the point is, they can do this because we've created a political system where the tiniest slice of Americans actually get to call the shots. And the only way to go back to a system where it's a broad swath of Americans who get to call the shots so that you don't get this kind of steering by a tiny group of Americans is to begin to disaggregate the money power game the way we disaggregated the voting power game. So democracy solved the voting power, somehow we've got to solve the money power. But until we do, every single thing we care about, and not just we in the internet space, but everything we care about in global warming, healthcare, tax system that makes sense, is going to continue to be susceptible to this highly unstable influence market that we have allowed to evolve over the period of just the last 20 years.
So I saw Larry a few weeks ago, and he actually told a very poignant story about the fact that he was not convinced that there was a solution to this problem, and yet he was fighting the problem. And one of my goals today is to see if we can, crack that conviction on his part open just a little bit, that there may be some things some tools that we can begin to play with here that would, without necessarily requiring that fundamental change in the way we finance politics, create a counterbalance. And I think we did start to see that with PipaSopa, that there is the possibility that some of these networks can actually reach out to the users who are emotionally invested in them and recruit them to do something.
Larry, I got a question for you. How much money will be spent in the presidential election this year by both sides? $2.5 billion.
$15 billion.
So $2.5 billion, and that includes the super PACs. Okay. So how much is the internet advertising business right now? 40 billion, 50 billion, 40 billion a year?
Yeah.
Okay. So if the internet decided to take 3% or 4% or 5% of its ad inventory and make it available for free, because the reason they raise all this money is to buy television ads, right? And instead, if the internet industry said, you know what, fuck television, we're going to make 5% of our inventory available to
Because it's not sold anyway.
The side of the problem you got to look at is not where the money is being spent, it's the effect it's having on the candidates. So if you spend 30 to 70% of your time raising money, the question is, who are you raising money from? And if you're raising money from the tiniest slice of the 1%, regardless of how much money is being spent, if we could cut the spending by 100th, it would still be the same dynamic. You're raising from the top 1%, the top fraction of 1%. You're going to be more sensitive to the fraction of 1% than you're going to be sensitive to the broad range of Americans. And this issue about small funding, there's a really amazing congressman from Maryland, John Sarbanes, Paul Sarbanes' son. So Sarbanes sort of presented this to me as a really compelling picture of what this problem is. He says, the biggest thing people are afraid of is 30 days before an election, a super PAC comes in and drops $1 million on the other side. And the problem for the incumbent is that at that point, they don't have anybody to turn to because their big contributors have maxed out. So who are they going to turn to? And he says what most people are now doing is that they're buying super PAC insurance in advance. And how do you buy super PAC insurance in advance? You basically signal to the super PACs on your side that you're the loyal kind of person they want you to be, so that when $1 million is dropped against you, they'll drop $1 million for you. This is a protection racket, right? So Sarbanes says, I want to build a different system. I want to build a system where I have small contributors. But he says it makes no sense for people today congressmen today to try to raise small contributions. It makes no sense at all. So he built this illegal structure where he's raised $750,000, and he is not allowed to touch that until he raises 1,000 small contributions. So that this money is already in the pot, But until he raises 1,000 small contributions, it doesn't come into his campaign. But his whole idea is that if he has 1,000 small contributions, then when somebody drops a super PAC bomb on the other side, he can turn to his small funders to get them into the campaign to help him fight back. But the point is, the current architecture of funding would never make that sensible for a congressman to do, which is why they spend all their time talking to,
how the internet that we want and that we want to protect and expand and fight for is what money out of politics looks like. It's the possibility of having, or of actually protecting the vote and participating in a vibrant political system where, some of the best political ideas rises to the top, or, some of the best candidates. And I think we reach that by, I don't know how we reach that, but what we do with the internet fight can really change the money in politics question, because maybe we can show, what a more democratically led and publicly enforced fight for a fair political system looks like.
Well,
and
so-
what public financing, I think, would be a great experiment that looks like the internet, that allows people to have equal resources to become candidates and to affect the political system.
So money is just a proxy for getting their message out, right? And the internet is the most efficient vehicle ever invented to get a message out. And I go back to my point that if you just took 2% or 5% of all the internet advertising that's sold every year, you'd be talking about more attention dollars than will be raised through the entire system. And maybe you tie those, access to those attention dollars to the Internet Freedom Pledge, meaning you get a consortium of the largest and smallest internet companies to all contribute a certain amount of their advertising inventory to a pool that's only available to those candidates who take the Internet Freedom Pledge.
That's what
Larry's
we're
idea.
Oh, you're already working on this idea. I didn't mean to take your idea.
No, not the
I think
advertising.
it's bigger, because I'm a little concerned at how this has gone from Hacking Society to Save the Open Internet, which is a great cause, but I thought we started on a bigger scale. Larry has, what is it, 2 Benjamins and 1 Frank, what is the
Franklin, the Grant and Franklin project.
Grand and Franklin Pledge?
But it's a brilliant, you're right, it's a
Yeah,
perfect
so
link
so
to Fred.
if basically the twist on yours is you can get access to the 5% pool of internet access if you renounce traditional fundraising.
Ah, so it's more than that. You're talking about opting out.
Yes, so you get this magic pool of money and access and whatever, as long as you don't take any money from
Yeah, so
traditional
you did the internet entrepreneur version of what I was talking about as a kind of public funding proposal. So my public funding proposal is, take the first $50 all of us contribute, quote unquote, contribute to the government treasury, and we all do contribute at least $50 in some form. Okay, send that back. Take my $50 back as a democracy voucher. I then can give my democracy voucher to any candidate who agrees to take only vouchers plus contributions of up to $100 a person, so Grant and Franklin. Okay, but what you've done is you've described a privatized version of that. You've said, okay, let's create a fund. The fund enables people to get access to this money if they pledge, maybe Yochai's or your internet pledge,
Working.
plus they give up, they don't take money from the other stuff. Now, $50 a voter turns out to be a huge amount of money. It's $7 billion, which is 3 times the total amount spent in the last congressional election. But the point is, it would be money where you're trying to get money from everybody as opposed to a tiny, tiny slice.
I think the internet side would be a distraction.
Maybe,
As much as I like that idea, but I think because I'm now a root striker, inspired by you, Larry, I feel like that there is that's a big enough problem on its own, and arguably the bigger problem, that it should be purely about reforming the system of campaign finance, and here's a way to do it without actually having to pass constitutional amendment or pass a bunch of laws. Like, you could just create this amazing economic incentive from the private sector that people would opt into because it would be all this free money.